Let's move on to the next topic, which is related to this. We've been giving large language models and generative AI and AI in general an awful lot of credit on this show and on many previous shows. But this is actually a bit of a counter argument or counter narrative to this. Apple has released a paper, and their researchers have been digging deep into the question of, can large language models really reason, or are they just regurgitating what they've indexed off the web? And this is a really big question. Sam Altman has said before, and actually others have said before, well, if you ask an LLM a really hard question or a really easy question, it takes the same amount of time to answer. And that was evidence that it's not really thinking. It's just spitting out tokens. And so then Sam Altman's like, hold my beer. They launched O1. It takes the question, it unpacks it, it reframes it, it comes up with a series of steps. They're calling it a reasoning model, right? And if you have access to O1, it's really quite incredible what it does. And it goes through a series of reasoning steps. Hard problems take longer to answer. Easy problems take less time to answer. And so that little debate, that little signal of maybe this thing isn't really reasoning, dissipated a little bit, right? Like, oh, okay, this new O1 model is really, really reasoning. But then the Apple researchers like, hold my beer. They're like, let's dig into this. All right, we're using standardized testing to test their reasoning ability, right? Like IQ and standardized tests and taking the bar exam. And we're saying, hey, wow, these things are passing the bar exam. And these things are passing standardized tests. So what the Apple engineers did is they changed the questions slightly, the standard questions from like Harry did this to Sally did this, or they did 3, bottles or 2 bottles. And they just changed the details of the question without changing the nature or architecture of the question. And what happened was that these models dramatically dropped in their efficacy in trying to take these standardized tests, with the hypothesis being, the implication being, they were indexing these tests. They were either being fed them explicitly to try to increase the benchmarks, or they're just finding them on the web. Once you change some of the subtleties of the nature of the test, the LLMs start to shit the bed. They're regurgitating, not thinking. I think this is super fascinating. One of the first things that blew my mind about LLMs is when I was listening to a researcher on This American Life, a Microsoft researcher, and he was talking about vetting ChatGPT 4 when they were doing diligence for the investment in OpenAI. And he had access to GPT-4 early. And he was like a veteran researcher. And he's like, he's not some newbie, just, guy playing with the model. He's an AI guru. And he was like, I asked ChatGPT 3 how to stack 4 eggs, a laptop, a book, and a pear. And it shat the bed, had no idea. It's like put an egg down and put the laptop on top of it and put the pear on top of that. I asked ChatGPT 4 how to do it. And it said, put the laptop on the ground, it'll be a strong base, put the 4 eggs, one on each corner, put the book on top, and then put the pear on top of that, something like that. He was saying to the host, I could not sleep that night. He's like, I couldn't believe that it answered that question the way it answered it, with reasoning and judgment. It's never seen a pear. It's never seen a laptop. It's like, how did it know? And I just got goosebumps listening to this podcast. But so I thought, that's it. Fuck, these things can they can reason, and not only reason, but reason about things like objects in physical space that I've never seen. I think this research paper is really interesting and maybe very telling. Hooman, have you had a chance to look at this paper or look at news about it? What are you thinking upon hearing about this?
I think first and foremost, you have to, we've been at Collective and following this because I'll tell you, when the early models pre GPT, I think it was like 3.5 turbo, for our use cases, and a lot of them around tax and accounting, and I'd say some more rote tasks, they actually weren't as effective and they weren't working. And working can be defined by some sort of benchmark. And then past 3.5 turbo, all of a sudden we saw this like massive uplift. So one thing that's clear is that the folks at OpenAI continue to get feedback and continue to make these models better and better and better. I think there is an overgeneralization from people that the GPT model, generative pre-trained transformers, is like the end all be all of AI. It is part of AI research and it's multifaceted. So there's vision, there's different disciplines. They're obviously using ML models and, you can use deeper multi-layered neural networks, but there's a lot. There's OCR, there's like all voice
Diffusion models.
And so when you look at this as a concert and you say to yourself, if I was to assemble this into a symphony orchestra, could I do some really interesting things? One of which is, could you create a multi-engine architecture, right? And each of these being a service layer with maybe an LLM at the front that would then
Hmm.
use these on the back end and create some sort of approximate intelligence reasoning. The answer is, okay, that's what I think is interesting. Now, is Sam, our OpenAI, going to do that with their GPT model? And then ultimately they are playing in some of these other subdisciplines, right? I mean, they're working, for example, I believe with some of these robotic companies like Figure and others where
Hmm.
that model is in there and using vision and so on and so forth. So I think it's interesting. And I'm sure that the Apple paper, I looked at it and it looked generally correct. So I would say two things. One is they'll probably upgrade the model to reason better. I think one of the most interesting understated things that OpenAI has done is the memory and the context windows that they're creating. Like, I don't know about you, but like I've had some like really freaky experiences and we came from like early days of the web. First, I mean, back for people that are as old as we are, every ad was not personalized. It was all like punch the monkey, flooding it with the same shit. Now you're seeing ads based on your browsing details. They know who you are. And it's very, very limited window. And the memory is quote unquote is the cookie on your machine. Now they're saying, all right, we're going to create a context window and you can use that. So for example, I have a daughter and it now knows I have a daughter. It knows how old she is. It knows things about me. I can see it. It says it's adding it to memory. And so the reason human beings are impressive is not just, it's a multifaceted approach to problem solving. And I think they're going to have to integrate more approaches into their, model. And I think it's going to work out. I think they're going to figure it out. I mean, sure, maybe Apple's right now, but it is a monumental achievement what they've done. And whether just a large language model in and of itself can solve the problem of reasoning intelligence, it's not the right question. The question is, can we, with the ensemble of different approaches, create a new, call it super agent that leverages multiple approaches so we can have a reasoning agent? And the answer is 100% yes, in my opinion. It's not a question of can we do it? It's a question of when can we do it and who's going to be first.
I think that's super interesting. I really like the term you're using around this, like the orchestra, right? The orchestra of models. I've heard Sam actually talk about this in both ways. He's talked about, basically the ChatGPT interface is a sort of collection of models and that it uses the right model for the right job. Especially if you ask it to generate an image, for example, it's using the DALL-E
Correct.
model, which is embedded inside the standard GPT-4 model, or rather it's being invoked by it, let's say. And so in some cases, in some places, I've heard him say, this is about a system of models wrapped around a user experience, right? Or a user experience wrapped around a system of models. But at the same time, I've heard him say, it's like he seems to have some kind of faith that, no, if you just keep throwing more and more and more data at an LLM, it will ultimately become the super generalized model of all time. And he just believes like there's really no end in sight to how smart this gets in and of itself, some unified fundamental model. And so, maybe the first thing is a stopgap. It's like, let's get it as far as we can with orchestration while we're just pumping this, building bigger and bigger and bigger models. But they're running out of data, so who knows where that goes.
Well, the GPT model, though, I mean, yes and no, right? Because the original, I mean, if you just look at how those transformers work, they're based on the insight that was derived from Google's typehead search, where you're doing basically, you're probabilistically figuring out what the next token is, right? That's not what they're doing only, right? They're going to parse effectively. You're going to predict it, but then they're kind of saying, okay, I'm going to route what kind of problem are you asking me to solve, right? Are you asking me
Mhm.
to generate an image? Are you asking me to do a web search? And they have to contextualize it. So definitionally, they're not just going to have like this quote unquote one model. Now,
No, but what I'm saying is right now they're doing what you describe.
yeah,
But he's also saying, he seems to be also hinting that there are not going to be hundreds of models. There's going to be one super intelligence, and it's just a matter of scale.
it could be. I would agree because fundamentally, evolution has proven that to be true. You have a base neural network inside of the brain. Now, we don't even understand how the brain works, but fundamentally, when you look at it from a reductionist point of view, bottoms up, right? You have neurons, synapses, axons, and there's a connection there, right? And so
Hmm.
if you look at it from that foundational point of view, can there be quote unquote one model at that level of abstraction? And if it's connected properly and so on and so forth, but even the brain has areas of specialization. Even the brain has multiple areas and so on and so forth. So I guess the question, I agree with him that you could create this model and you can have an emergent intelligence from that level of model, but it does subspecialize from an emergent perspective, in the brain. We don't know how, whether it's like Wernicke's area for speech or these different areas. And so I think he's probably right that there is some possibility of a substrate for that. But then, okay, we have to talk about memory. We have to talk about this idea of consciousness. Like you need a buffer space between, okay, I'm talking to you right now. So I'm taking in all these inputs from my senses. I'm not actually processing and talking to you in real time. There's a slight delay, right? We just don't perceive that. I'm taking an input. I create this model. There is no Chris. Like I'm making this up. Like I don't know what you actually look like at the scale of the universe. If you want to get down to the science level, I'm using it based on my sensors. A dog will see a different Chris. A bee will see a different Chris. Like there is no absolute Chris. It's all relative to my model. And so, yes, he's right in that sense. I think scientifically you can go there. I don't know if the GPT, like the transformer itself, that technical approach is the correct approach, I guess is what I'm saying. And I don't know if you need it right now. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, you can probably do this orchestra of existing specialized models, getting you pretty far. But there's a company, and I don't want to like blow up, but there's a company I'm working on now that has done a verifiable biological like model of the brain, and it's very different. One of the properties of this model is that you don't need back propagation as much, which means you can save a ton of power and you can do real-time processing of voice, real-time processing of ideas in a way that the transform model can't do. So whether or not the model of this new company that I'm, kind of working on is correct or false, the point is there are other ways of looking at this. It'll be interesting. I think we're just in some ways, the early innings. It's just a very fast game.
It's a technology cycle for the TikTok generation, right?
Yes, that's a great way of saying it. It's wild how fast it's going. It's doubling every 3.5 months in terms of the efficacy per those benchmarks. And it's just thinking at that scale as a human being is challenging. I remember we were sitting with a bunch of guys who were entrepreneurs in LA. Garrett was there actually. And we were talking about when everything started getting fast. I mean, there was this moment, I can't remember when it was, but again, probably a little after 3.5 turbo, we just started seeing it. And it felt like, we're like, wow, this is as fundamental a shift as the internet. But unlike the internet, where like, at least from my cohort, we were like filled with hope about all the applications, we're filled with some level of anxiety too, because you can't quite forecast, like I can't quite visualize 20 years from now. There's too many curves compounding.
Or you can, and we've seen it in the science fiction movies, and it's terrifying. And so it's both, right? You can't forecast how we avoid all landmines, and or worse, many writers and creatives have forecasted how it goes wrong. And so it really fires the imagination, and it really triggers a lot of anxiety for us. And the closer this machinery looks to a human being, the more, we start maybe getting into the uncanny valley of like repulsion, like, get the fuck away from me. Like, you are trying to be me. And so now, if you see these movies where there's like clones or duplicates that show up, it's creepy as hell, right? And you have now a computing layer, a substrate, an artificial not consciousness, but an artificial cognition. Then you look at it and you're like, that's amazing and horrifying at the same time. I am no longer, or I can see a day when my humanity is no longer unique in the universe. You put aside all the pragmatic economics and, misinformation or whatever, just the uncanny valley of, wow, we have cloned our uniqueness into bits, versus atoms is crazy to think about.
I'll give you a slightly different perspective. I think that every human being is fundamentally unique in the most definitional sense of it and as an intelligence. I think the question is not, in my opinion, whether we'll be unique. It is now you can see a world where, from an economic point of view, for example, is that uniqueness going to drive the same value? And if it does not, what does that mean for me? Because our society is driven by like so much of it through this like capitalistic intent. And so if some machine can do 80% of what I can do at a pretty damn good price, what is the implication for me? I think there's some fear there, but I don't think the science fiction stuff I think it's so wrong. It's laughable. I think like the Terminator scenario is so laughable.
I'm saying something slightly different, which is put aside the economic piece of it, which will cause disruption and productivity and abundance and all of that stuff, and put aside the uniqueness at the individual human level. I'm talking about humans have for our entire existence perceived ourselves to be at the top of the food chain as it relates to intelligence in the universe, the known intelligence in the universe. And we are, for the first time, encountering glimmers of intelligence embodied in an entity that is not of our category, human being, right? The more that this intelligence becomes embodied in robotics and whatever, and anthropomorphized, again, to draw on science fiction, if you ever seen the Animatrix, where they talk about the origins of the Matrix, people started to taunt and bully and be revolted by robots, and because their humanness was in the general, not their uniqueness in the specific, but in the general, was almost called into question, as well as their economic purpose was called into question. And so I'm talking about kind of this existential philosophical angst we might start to encounter. In a previous episode, we talked about the opposite, which is people start to imbue these things with agency and feelings and start to fight like robot rights, like there's slavery and we should defend them. And you could imagine the opposite, where the people start to feel an affinity for them. And the people who, think of them as objects and those who think of them as creatures actually start to argue that in really meaningful ways. So these are very existential things I'm talking about now. We're kind of off the beaten track in terms of pragmatic.
Actually, I think it's very pragmatic, and I'm gonna actually credit you. I think I was talk that they were talking about alignment, and this is a
Mm,
topic that is probably like I wouldn't say for everyday people when you're talking
mhm.
about AI. It's not something that they care about. How do we align AI with our interests? Okay, fundamentally, the way you do it is if they need a role, it needs to be part of the fabric. Show me a society where you put someone in a role where they're subservient, where they're consistently lower than you, and when that outcome has ended up
Yeah.
without some sort of conflict.
They need to be enfranchised.
So I think from an alignment perspective, you have to start thinking about,
Coexistence.
yeah, exactly. And I actually think the reason why I think a lot of science fiction is off is I'll put a grim version and I'll go hopeful. The grim version is this: Terminator is a joke. Like they're
Mhm,
not gonna we anthropomorphize these things. Oh, the advanced version of AI will be robots and they'll walk and they'll do everything we do. That's a joke.
mhm.
What the robots can do if they get to a point is they'll say, I'm gonna go to get some CRISPR stuff. Oh, I read about this COVID thing. I'm going to go ahead and start a super violent disease and I'm just going to spread it all over, that's it. You're gone like that. I don't need to deal with it. You are fundamentally built on this biological hardware, which I can write software for and I can release this virus and that's that, right?
But
If they
just to,
wanted
just
to.
to be clear, when you say it's a joke, you don't mean the scenario that the AI chooses to take over is a joke.
We cannot fight them.
You're saying the implementation details are a joke. There's
Yeah.
no need for bullets and battles and nukes. There's a biological war they can wage against us that we have no
What are
hope
you
of winning.
fighting when you're
Right.
fighting? We created a distributed infrastructure called the internet with redundant computing and redundant power. We're doing it because we want to protect ourselves, right? That is going to be the creature you're fighting, right?
Hmm.
It is
Hmm.
fundamentally not stored in one place. It
Hmm.
is super intelligent and it knows everything that's weak about us when we are hardware. Like you might nuke one area and then it just, oh, well, I backed myself up over there, right? So
That's right.
that's my grim version of it.
Hmm.
But I also think that what we're missing is we as a society, technology is our invention, right? It is an emergent property of an intelligent and conscious being, right? When you have technology and we are, in my opinion, moving towards it. And this might be the utopian, I don't remember what's that thing that they always do, the ECC, or I always forget what
Oh,
the,
EAC and
whatever it is, right? Okay. But like fundamentally, how many hours a day do people spend with their phone? And if you want to be brutal, how much do you spend in front of a screen?
yeah.
Most of your waking hours are in front of a screen. What we are electing to do right now is we are already on path to merge with technology. And I will argue in the next generation, first it'll be like, oh, I'll have them in my AirPods and I'll be talking to this agent, but eventually a brain computer interfaces and eventually be like in your eyes. And all these technologies are happening at the same time. So we just anthropomorphize and take AI and say, oh, it's going to exist external to us and be a robot. It's like, no, dude, this is going to be closer and closer. Like our kids will be walking around and Google Maps. So they'll be able to walk anywhere they want. They'll just know where to go because
Yes.
of like augmented reality and AI and all these things. And it can become symbiotic is what I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, we wanted to talk about this in our last topic. Elon Musk's vision for Neuralink is exactly this, right? And we wanted to touch on Elon talking to Putin, but we're going to run out of time here. But yeah, I mean that's the kind of the Musk answer is we need to find a way to merge with this thing as fast as possible, or we're screwed. And so
I don't think we do. I think we will.
you don't think we do what?
In my opinion, some people believe history can be made by individuals. Some people think it's inevitable. It's kind of like the Asimov. You look at Foundation as an example, like how much of it is probabilistic waves driven by the masses of humanity. It was kind of inspired by macroeconomics, economics, the psychohistory thing.
It's kind of like almost the Messiah worldview, which is, I think, very
Yeah.
Christian or religious
Elon
or
Musk or
Abrahamic.
someone is going to save us. But my point of view is that avatar, that character will come because of the fundamental like shift in needs. So I can't guarantee you that we're going to get through. There is going to be a reckoning at some point,
Hmm.
but I don't think it's going to be this moment, this like Skynet is on. And then we're like, there's this phase shift that we're like, oh, it's us and them and they're awake. I think it's going to be like one of these things where we're slowly from the perspective of we're not going to see it, right? Like look at Google. Can you drive anywhere, Chris, without Google Maps?
I think the analogy here is it's going to look more like the US and China than humans and Skynet. It's these two emerging powers, or in this case, an emerging power in China, and meeting economically, technologically, whatever. I think what you're describing is that this power, this alien creature, is going to slowly emerge. And it's, as you said, the alignment problem is going to need to be enfranchised. It's going to need to given a role. We're going to find ways of coexisting with it. There may be flashpoints of conflict or confusion or pain,
Like
suffering economically.
Like the Waymo stuff that was happening downtown. Remember where people were like beating up the car or whatever? But like, you mark my words, those people are beating up their car. Their kids are not going to drive in a car. They're going to be driving in a Waymo or something. You know what I mean? Like the Luddites, back in
Yes,
industrial evolution who are, oh my gosh, this is the worst. 80% of our economy is agrarian. Those people's kids now are the people who are picketing and saying, don't close down our factories with automation. And so
that's right.
it's going to keep happening. My optimistic view is it'll happen because it has to. And I think that humans find a way. And I believe that there are some statistical phase transitions that we have to navigate as a group, and we'll do our best to do it. But look at how far humanity has come and look at what we're doing. And yeah, there can be some setbacks, but I think AI is not alien it is us. We are creating tools that are intrinsically us, and it will merge with us in a way that makes sense over a period of time. In 100 years, I don't believe that humanity as it exists today is going to exist at the scale that it does. I think it's going to be very, very different. And it's not a bad thing. It's okay. It's like, would we be upset? Like, we didn't exist, right? We're a relatively new species. So if you use the argument like humanity has an intrinsic right to exist as it is today, then we shouldn't be here. We took it from, the previous species and we're like, you know what I mean? So, and it doesn't have to be violent.
Yeah, there's that. If you look at it kind of in a more abstract way, the question is only whether life and cognition and intelligence exists. There's nothing saying it has to be embodied in the Homo sapien, in the human race. And so there's going to be an evolution that occurs, that might be a merger of, a change of the guard, whatever. And, life will continue, life will find a way. It may not, and it will not look like it looks today. And trying to hold on to that with the genie back in the bottle is actually
It's
impossible. So
impossible.
we need to embrace it and participate in it optimistically. All right, those are our thoughts about, can LLMs reason, and what is the future of humanity, and how do we coexist with these embodied AIs? Are we going to fall in love with them? Are we going to defend them? Are we going to fight with them? Is it going to be like the rise of China where we have to find a way to coexist with them? So many possibilities. Jump in the comments and let us know your thoughts.